Hello.
Hi there.
Thank you for talking to us today. For the sake of our audience being more informed, please introduce yourself and tell us about your area of expertise.
Okay, my name is Geraint Lansdown. I'm from the UK, and I've worked in the field of children's rights for over 25 years. And for the last 15 years, I've been working internationally as an advocate and consultant in children's rights, with a particular focus on children's participation, but also on the rights of children with disabilities.
You mentioned children's participation. What does it mean in your view?
It means recognising that children are entitled to contribute to decisions that affect them, whether as individuals in relation to their own healthcare, decisions in the family, decisions in school, or as a collective, as a constituency, the right to be to have a say in the things that happen in their lives, whether at a community level, local level, individual, school level. The right to be listened to be taken seriously, and to be involved and to inform the things that matter in their lives.
In a sentence, why is child participation important?
Oh, I can't do that in a sentence. It's fundamentally important to recognising the child as a citizen, the child who has dignity. It's also absolutely imperative to think about the importance of participation as a protective measure, that if we silence children, we don't know when things are going wrong for them, when they're being abused, when they're being hurt or neglected, and it's only by listening to children and creating space to hear them that we can begin to offer better protection.
How can we encourage child participation, especially for the most vulnerable children?
Well, it's a complex process. We're 25 years into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we're still all learning about how to do this effectively. Basically, it needs a number of different levels. It needs the creation of an infrastructure, if you like, a legal policy framework in which there is a recognition of entitlement for participation, because that acts as the spur, if you like, the lever for advocacy to create a change. If we recognise in law the entitlement and have the policies in place. Secondly, you need training. You need training of professionals working with children and for children on their rights and how to work with them in a more collaborative, participative way. And that includes lawyers, judges, police, doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, residential workers, policymakers. And finally, we need to think about how we create spaces for children which are child-friendly and accessible and safe, where children can begin to explore and develop their own thinking. So schools where there are school councils and opportunities for children to come together, also at a community level, maybe in a hospital, at all sorts of levels we need to think about how we create safe spaces, creative spaces where children can begin to share their thoughts.
In your view, what are the requirements for child participation to be considered meaningful and effective?
Well, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the international monitoring body for the Convention, has identified 9 basic requirements. So basically what you need, first of all, it's voluntary. Participation is a right, not an obligation, so children should never be forced into expressing their views when they don't want to, or to taking part when they don't want to. The participation needs to be relevant. Expecting children to get involved in issues that are not relevant or important or significant for them is not good participation. It needs to be informative. So if children engaged in an activity, they need to know the parameters, they need to know what's possible, they need to have information about their rights and about the situation, so they can make a meaningful, significant contribution to that process. Information is absolutely key to effective participation. It needs to be safe. It needs to be a space where children really feel safe to explore their views. There are no risks attached, and those risks are properly assessed. It needs to be supported by effective trained adults. It needs to be inclusive, so that we begin to create spaces where children learn to respect each other, children from different groups, different ages, different levels of ability, and so on. And it needs to be accountable. So one of the things children complain of most of all when adults start listening to them is they came here, they sat down, asked us what our views, we gave them all this information, and that was the last we ever heard of them. So the adults then go away and the children have no idea, did they listen, did they do anything, how did they hear what we said. So there's a really important that there is accountability on the part of adults, that if adults say they're going to do something, they do it, and they tell children about it, so children are able to engage in an ongoing process of change.
Are there any risks associated with child participation?
Yeah, there are. There are risks. Because ultimately participation is about power. It's about, the situation traditionally where adults have all the power and children have no power. And what you're trying to do is shift that balance. And in the same way as other groups of people who've struggled to exercise their rights, you look at the civil rights movement in America, you look at women's rights movements, you get a backlash very often. And so, for example, if children say something in the media, there may be a backlash from parents, there may be a backlash in schools. It depends on the country. In some situations, children may be at risk of being imprisoned if they speak out and really say strongly what it is they think is wrong with the government or with the way that they're being treated. There are also risks about breeding of cynicism, because if children are encouraged to speak out and then nothing happens and nobody listens, then children can become disaffected from the democratic process and begin to believe they can't make a difference and democracy doesn't work. So that's a risk that participation brings.
Can you give us a positive example or a number of examples of child participation in countries or regions that you are familiar with? What works best?
There's no best. There's no blueprint. But it's a process which needs to be organic, which reflects the culture, the political environment, the economic, social development in a country, the level of interest and motivation, and it needs to be a creative process with children and people themselves. Interestingly, some of the most sophisticated work that I've seen has been in South Asia, surprising to many people. There are some wonderful initiatives in India, for example, where adults have created a space for children to set up their own organisations. One in particular we've worked with called the Concern for Working Children, where the children have spent time together, supported by adults, that they identify the issues of concern. One particular fascinating example where the children identified the most important issue facing them was violence as a consequence of alcoholism amongst their fathers. So violence towards their mothers and violence towards them. And they wanted to challenge the fathers and highlight within their community just how much damage this was doing. And they engaged in an extraordinarily effective process. They identified that the alcohol was being sold in illegal outlets, so they went to the police. And the police said, go away, we're not interested in this, they were just children. So then they found that what the adults and men were doing was going to these places, buying beer, flicking the lids off, and then going off with the beer. So they started collecting the lids of the beer, and they started collecting from all the outlets in the region. They then added up the number of beer. This was just the ones that were flipped off outside the shops. They added up the number of beer, units of beer that had been sold. They multiplied that by the cost per item. They multiplied that by a month and then a year, and therefore worked out how much was being spent illegally on alcohol in their community. They then did a comparison of what that would buy in terms of children's clothes, children's school books, children's education, children's health, and then looked at how much was being deprived within the families by illegal outlets. And then with all of that research evidence, they then went back to the police and to the municipality and to what it was called, village development council, which is local responsible political structure, and to their parents. And there was such horror at what they'd exposed that they called a meeting of the whole community to begin to look at how can we deal with this has to be changed. The police came in and closed down the illegal outlets, and the community developed a plan to promote zero tolerance of violence against children through alcohol.
That's fascinating.
An amazing,
really.
amazing outcome.
Yeah. What are your impressions so far of Bulgaria? Do you think that child participation is gaining momentum here? How is it developing?
I think that all of the obviously there are differences between them, but all of the countries emerging from the communist era have had a huge journey to make in terms of building and strengthening the very concept of civil society and democratic engagement from the grassroots up. So I think that Bulgaria's made enormous progress given the challenge of where you started from, because many other countries have had strong civil society organisations for decades and decades and decades, and you're starting from scratch. So I think there's been an extraordinary progress. You've got a lot of really exciting organisations working. You've got a national network of children doing work on children's participation. LUMAS, who are doing really interesting work with children with intellectual impairments. You've got this whole initiative to develop, which is supported by the government, which is by the State Agency for Child Protection, which is great to have that endorsement from a national level to build a framework. I think there's a long way to go. This is always a learning process. It's a learning process in every country. So you're nowhere near there yet. No one is. There's no country. So it's not a criticism of Bulgaria. But I think there's an openness to learning. I think there's a commitment to trying to make it better. And I think there's a lot of people who are engaged in a constructive dialogue to strengthen that process. So we're pushing at an open door, I think, in Bulgaria. Lots of problems, lots of people still resistant, but that's going to be true in every country. So.
My final question, how do we evaluate child participation in the end, and what outcomes does it ultimately aim for, child participation itself?
Okay, so I've been involved in developing a tool for monitoring and evaluating children's participation, and it looks at three dimensions. So firstly, it looks at what's the scope of the participation. So at what point did children get involved? You know, did they get involved when it was already set up and designed, or did they get involved in identifying what the issues were, planning, prioritising and designing, and then implementing, and then in evaluating the process? So they're involved in a whole cyclical dimension. Did children get involved in all of that? And if they did, at what level? Were they just consulted? Were they involved in collaborating? Or did they have an opportunity to lead in those processes? So it's important to look at the nature of what you're actually doing. And then the second part is to look at the quality, looking at those basic requirements of meaningful participation and getting children to really evaluate, you know, was it inclusive, was it child-friendly, was it respectful, was it voluntary, and begin to look at where that could be strengthened or improved. And then the final part is looking at outcomes. So there are two levels of outcomes. There are outcomes for children and within their community, and we hear from almost every good initiative anywhere in the world that when children get involved, they speak positively about their own personal development, their learning, their self-confidence, the way they're viewed within their community, improved relationships with their family. So we see consistently very, very solid outcomes. Then there are outcomes in terms of what's changed in terms of the realisation of children's rights. And that needs to be decided by any particular program or project in partnership with the children at the outset of the project, so that we can begin to evaluate what is it we want to achieve, how will we measure whether we've got there, so we can reflect back. And people find that quite hard, actually. But that's a process, though. So if the objective was, for example, if it was to reduce the level of corporal punishment used in a school, so you need to do a baseline, you need to look at how frequently does it happen now, and then look at the measures you took, and then maybe 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, did we make a difference, and how did our participation make a difference? What did we do to contribute to that change? And we know anecdotally that there has been a huge number of experiences where children's participation has achieved change. The Indian example I gave you just one, but we need more documented evidence of that, so we can build a repository of stories and evidence to help us make the case to encourage donors and to encourage governments to take this issue more seriously.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.